Welcome back to Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Well, we're kicking off Season 6 of Land Matters with the topic of technology. Just a remarkable pace of advances and innovations over the last few years that are already changing the way cities function. As we all await the ultimate reveal, will things like artificial intelligence actually improve not only efficiency and sustainability, but ultimately the quality of life in human settlement around the world? For this conversation, we're joined by someone who is well positioned to reflect on all of this, Rob Walker, author of the technology-focused City Tech column that has appeared in Landlines magazine over the last several years. 20 of those columns, looking at everything from driverless vehicles to skyscrapers built entirely with wood, have been compiled in a book recently published by the Lincoln Institute and Columbia University Press, City Tech: 20 apps, ideas, and innovators changing the urban landscape. It's got a foreword by tech journalist Kara Swisher and an afterword by author Greg Lindsay. He writes, "If the last decade of urban tech has been a dress rehearsal, then the curtain is now rising on the most momentous decade of change most cities have ever had to face. It's our turn to formulate what we demand from our technologies versus the other way around." Rob Walker is a journalist and columnist covering technology, design, business, and other subjects. He's a contributor to the New York Times, writes a column on branding for Fast Company, and has contributed to Bloomberg Businessweek, The Atlantic, Fortune, Marketplace, and other outlets. He's also co-editor of Lost Objects, 50 Stories About the Things We Miss and Why They Matter, and author of The Art of Noticing. His Art of Noticing newsletter is at robwalkersubstack.com, and he also serves on the faculty of the School of Visual Arts in New York City. Rob Walker, thank you so much for joining the conversation at Land Matters.
Thank you so much for having me, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we step back and I ask you about how you became interested in writing about technology and everything we'll end up trying to cover, I just want to dive right in on the subject that is on everybody's minds these days, and that's artificial intelligence. I simply can't resist because of all the technological advances we've seen, AI really does seem to have the potential to be transformational. So let's start with this question. I'm going to have a little fun here. How will AI change urban planning? And before you answer, I also couldn't resist. I asked Bing and Google, posing the question just that way. And here's an answer, and let's figure out whether it sizes things up pretty well. AI is making urban planning more efficient by using data to predict trends and help cities grow in sustainable ways. AI can analyze patterns to optimize land use, design cities more effectively, and make more accurate predictions about future urban needs. What do you think? Is that a good summary? How else will AI factor into the physical arrangements of how we live?
Sure. I think that that's a perfectly fine answer. It's a good answer, particularly in that it's emblematic of AI right now, and that it's a lot of this sort of successful, correct stuff is stuff that no one would seriously disagree with anyway. The tricky part of writing about technology, whether it's about city technology or any kind of technology, is always sorting out the potential future, which future you're talking about, how far in the future, and versus what's realistic, what's concrete, what's provable, what's not pie in the sky. In that spirit, apply that to all technology, but especially to AI, because as you know from the coverage, there's this mix of people using it right now to have a virtual girlfriend or something, which doesn't seem like a very important topic, to how it can be used in the sciences to, literally cure cancer. And perhaps that will happen. But there's a lot of steps in between. So it is with its application in cities. So when I wrote the column about it, I was looking for what are cities playing with right now? And the answer is a little bit more prosaic than the nice Google response that we just got. But it's real. And one of the on the ground things I found is happening now is a lot of experimenting with processing permits, which is a zoning issue. And a couple of the municipalities I talked to in Canada, where there's a big housing crunch, there's a housing crunch in the United States too. They've got huge backlogs caused partly by whether it's for single family homes, multifamily dwellings, mixes of codes, overlapping codes, because they've got a sort of, I think it's called the Ottawa Code, all municipality projects have to comply to. It can do anything from materials to it's a confusing process for contractors, it's a confusing process for landowners, it's a confusing process for developers, and it's a confusing process for cities. And a lot of that comes down to raw efficiency, to the ability to have raw efficiency in processing lots and lots of paperwork, digital paperwork. And in Honolulu, they had run a pilot program. They had a 6-month backlog on some of their permitting processes that in their pilot, they were able to cut to a matter of days, which who knows how that will hold up as they expand the pilot and expand into further experimentation. But that kind of thing augurs pretty well. Humans are still very much a part of that process. There's no one going to a planning zone chatbot and walking out with a permit. There's not going to be a sudden building suddenly authorized only by robots anytime soon. But that can be a real win. So where it goes from there, I think that we have to be realistic about how we pay attention to this stuff and be excited about the experiments that are going on. But we're a little bit of a ways away from the vision of the future that Google shared with you on AI. So we'll see.
I think part of it's what's so almost thrilling about it is that a lot of this has to do with essentially computer processing speed, right?
Oh, yeah.
So whereas in geospatial mapping, which I hope we'll talk about in a bit, it might take months to analyze satellite data of land use, but now it only takes a few moments or it's virtually instantaneous. So that means the smart people can get right to work on policy initiatives or actions on the ground because they're armed with this first rate and fast empirical evidence, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think you just nailed it in terms of it's not just the raw volume of data involved, but the apparent ability to analyze it with some trustworthiness that I think for projects like the geospatial project that you're talking about, there's already huge amounts of data there and, unprecedented amounts of satellite imagery and whatnot that's potentially life-changing in very literal ways in managing climate effects and so on. And they're slowed down just by ability to process and think about some of that data and project options. You can tweak the data, you can get instantaneous. It's the same thing that in some ways that's going on with just getting permitting for a store on a corner. The process just can be shortened immensely. And it's how AI is going to integrate with other technologies that's going to sort of prove its ultimate mettle.
Well, let's pick up on geospatial mapping. There are many other things to talk about, but this is just something that's kind of near and dear at the Lincoln Institute with our Center for Geospatial Solutions. Here you've got essentially a platoon of analysts using satellite data to make sense of land use changes over time, including building on another initiative that we had in partnership with UN Habitat and NYU, the Atlas of Urban Expansion. But another manifestation is something called Who Owns America? And just really quickly, as you know, it's identifying who owns land and property to start out in the U.S. And then you could take it to the next step and figure out where's the buildable land for housing, whether it's federal-owned land, municipal-owned land, land and property owned by religious institutions. It really does feel like a window on the world, kind of like a real-time dashboard where planners can see forest fires and floods and extreme heat and see how that's all intersecting with the migration and settlement of people. It just seems like it's an incredible application of technology that could very well end up protecting people's lives, or at least perhaps minimizing misery.
Which is an excellent goal. Let's agree. And you're touching on the way that all the technologies you're talking about, the key a lot of the time is number one, not to be completely overwhelmed because there is so much data of different kinds. And two, is figuring out how these things can talk to each other or be synthesized and analyzed. And that brings us back to that AI component that this is where I think it can be a tremendous tool to help analyze. But the projects that you're talking about, there's a lot of human judgment involved there. And what are our priorities going to be? What are our goals? Why are they our goals? And who shapes those goals? We're not quite yet in the area where we can just turn that all over to AI. We still need the true expertise that's been keeping an eye on these programs and goals for long periods of time to shape these tools and make sure the tools aren't shaping us.
Let's step back for a minute. Can you talk more about how you got interested in writing about technology and how the City Tech column appearing in Landlines magazine evolved into a more expansive view of tech? How did that all unfold for you?
Well, the very quick backstory on me is that I had a background in business journalism going back some years. And as a writer, that branched out into, on the one hand, a lot of stuff about marketing and branding, but on the other hand, a lot of stuff about technology. I don't like to make a lot of predictions. I like to know what's the reality of this on the ground right now. And maybe we can extrapolate a bit from there, but let's not leap into the flying car territory before we've, even taught these things how to park themselves. The City Tech column came about. There were more and more interesting things going on with technology in the culture. And some of those things just naturally affected the way cities, the way land gets used, the way cities get zoned, the way transportation works, the way populations are settled, and on and on and on. From the biggest to the smallest, from how things get delivered to how deserts are managed. So when we started, it was pretty much like, let's look at interesting apps and programs and things like this. And over time, we got more adventurous about what we meant by technology. So that in more recent years, the column has, you mentioned at the top, technology about timber skyscrapers using a process that makes the wood able to handle the load that is necessary for that kind of building, and what the climate implications are and things like that. I think that when we started, we didn't know how long it would go. And here we are, I guess it's almost 10 years now of this column, and no shortage of interesting developments happening with cities and technology.
What were some of the themes that emerged? For one thing, it was interesting to note, similar to how we interviewed mayors through COVID, you picked up on all kinds of experimentation and sort of by necessity innovation that was triggered by the pandemic. What were some examples, especially maybe something that has endured to this day?
Well, a lot of things that endured to this day endured in different forms than they were imagined in the COVID moment. But the most striking thing about COVID to me was how quickly cities adjusted, and not just adjusted in superficial ways, but in real ways. The example I often point to is the way the curb is managed. And as you know, the traffic patterns, parking patterns and whatnot completely changed. There was a huge uptick in things being delivered, a huge downswing in people going to downtown to do their shopping. That wasn't happening as much anymore. So it became more of a hub and spoke situation. So that opened up opportunities for private companies to come in with, there's all kinds of delivery robots and whatnot that got sort of their initial test runs during that period. Some of those are still operating today, some are not. That's to be expected. But also zoning changes and implementing ways of monitoring what kind of vehicle could park where for how long using apps and digital means. In Aspen, for example, they dove right into a program and they were changing zoning stuff very rapid fire. There was no time to waste with the meetings and the things like this. That was really interesting. And I think that that exact thing hasn't endured, but some sense of the fact that cities can act with more nimbleness in response to situations, whether that's a situation as dire as COVID, which hopefully we won't experience again anytime soon, but also, I think, to incursions by disruptive private companies operating in the public space that we saw happen with some of the rideshare and home share services prior to COVID, that where cities were kind of blindsided and felt that they had just had to react and had to be very deliberate in how they reacted. And I think now there's more of a spirit of A, quick reaction, and B, working with those companies when they can, instead of it becoming an automatically antagonistic relationship. And I shouldn't make it sound like that was just on the city, the antagonism. I think that companies have learned that there are benefits to working with cities more carefully too, that attitude shift has been pervasive on both sides.
Yeah, with delivery vehicles alone or drones delivering stuff, it changes the essential nature of how cities operate and ebb and flow. That happened in a short time. Do you have a favorite column or place where you learned a lot or otherwise were impressed in any kind of special way? I'm going to prompt you here, but you can ignore it. I had some special interest in the piece you did on noise. That's just not something that I think most people think about, but it really does have an impact on quality of life.
I'll talk a little bit about noise because it was a favorite one as subject matter. It actually there's quite a history actually of attempts to mitigate noise problems using different soundproofing materials, different architectural decisions, and the kind of idea of noise pollution dates back some decades. But there was a really interesting scholar that I worked with on that piece, or who I interviewed for that piece, named Erica Walker, no relation. She had done a noise audit that had gotten her sort of started, but her evolution in thinking about it was that a lot of it gets covered as sort of a nuisance issue for a particular stratum of society, that they don't want loud music coming from the club within earshot. But she was taking a more totalizing viewpoint where it linked in with other kinds of environmental issues and class-based issues and things like this, where there were much more serious problems of noise linked up with much more serious problems around the location of a factory or a wastewater facility or something like that. So she really opened a door on how to use this one attribute of city life and city technology. The technology allowed us to measure it in different ways and to combat it in different ways, but also taught us the limits of technology. Sometimes you just need to make better land use decisions. You don't need to come back in with elaborate monitors that give people tickets for driving a loud car through a neighborhood. You need to plan your neighborhoods better. The other column that I really had a lot of fun with, because it surprised me so much, was a column that was pretty recent, last year or two, on electric bikes. And this is another one that is a little bit COVID related. There was a huge spike in interest in bikes and bike lanes. It's not a totally new phenomenon, but it got a big boost. And what excited me about electric bikes was the evidence that they are truly reaching a different population of riders. There's always been a percentage of the city population that was bike friendly and bike interested and bike advocacy. But electric bikes open it up to a larger group of people. And that's had some really interesting implications. The main implication is just this is a technology that is popular with more citizens in a way that gets people excited and gets them engaged. And as much as we talk about it, you and I have talked about just now, cities, companies, government people, private planners, or whatever, the missing ingredient there that we're not talking about is citizens. And that's a theme in the book too, is projects that are trying to find new ways to get citizens involved using technology. But one way is to present a technology that citizens are actually excited about, and that gets you that constituency that's willing to stand up, get involved, make their voice heard, be part of the planning process, which, as you know, planners love. They don't want people blocked out of the planning process. They want participation, and they want participation early. Too often participation comes in the fact of people complaining after a project is complete. So I'm very fond of some of the electric bike work being done across the country and in other countries as well.
Not to ask you to predict, but to ask you to predict. Dare we even think about it? What's next?
What's next? Well, I can say that it's always hard to answer that question, but it's very hard now for policy reasons. As you know, we're going through an interesting moment in terms of national priorities that's going to have some repercussions that are quite widespread. So one of the trends we saw coming out of the last 5 or 10 years was an increased interest in projects that address climate change in some way or other. I hope that we continue to see more of that. I'm a little concerned that the political will is not going to be as strong as it has been in recent years. On a more prosaic front, I think we're going to see, I have a column in the works on augmented reality, which is sort of the adding digital information to the urban environment that you can see through those Facebook glasses, or Snap has the special glasses, as well as your phone. But the real thing that a lot of people are looking at is how that will move to the eye, and what kind of opportunities will be available, and what the implications are for public space. Could be as simple as new wayfinding measures, could be interfacing with AI in ways you can learn about your environment around you. There could be any number of commercial uses that we can't quite anticipate yet. And one of the things I'm trying to look at on that one, to circle back to a topic we addressed a little bit earlier, is how cities can avoid being blindsided by that technology becoming more pervasive. That's the best I can do prediction-wise.
That's great. I want to try a pair of those glasses. Rob Walker, the author of City Tech, 20 Apps, Ideas, and Innovators Changing the Urban Landscape. Thank you so much for this conversation on Land Matters.
Thank you, Anthony. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Well, City Tech is easy to find. You just go to the Lincoln Institute website, and that is lincolninst.edu. And like Mayor's Desk, City Tech will soon be available as an ebook. Rob and I will be co-moderators of a special session with mayors at the American Planning Association National Planning Conference in Denver next month, so we're looking forward to that. While you're at the website, scroll to the bottom and join our mailing list to get periodic updates on all of our work. Also on social media, the handle is @LandPolicy. Finally, don't forget to rate, share, and subscribe to the Land Matters podcast. For now, I'm Anthony Flint, signing off until next time.